Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to Brightbeam's first virtual town hall. I'm happy to welcome each and every one of you with us. We are going to be sharing some very important information with you all. It's definitely going to be interactive. There'll be lots of information shared for you in the links, in the comments, and we'll be taking questions as well towards the end of our broadcast. I am Zakiya Sankara-Jabar, and I'm happy to be the National Director of Activism for the Brightbeam Network. I am really excited to introduce to you my colleagues who are joining me for this most important discussion today, seeking child justice. What a moment in this time in history for us to be talking about such a thing like this, child justice. And so now I'll take an opportunity to allow each and every one of my colleagues and guests to introduce themselves so that you know who they are. Christopher Stewart is our CEO of Brightbeam. Can you introduce yourself, Chris? I think you're on mute. You got to unmute yourself. There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm Chris Stewart. I'm the CEO of Brightbeam. We are a national education nonprofit seeking to shine a light on the kids at the margins of prosperity in our American cities.
Thank you. And next up is my wonderful colleague, Nekima Levy-Armstrong. Can you introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. My name is Nekima Levy-Armstrong. I am a civil rights attorney, an activist here in Minneapolis. I'm also the executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation, and it's an honor to be here.
Thank you. Welcome, Nekima. My next colleague that I'd like to introduce is Ms. Kedda Williams, and she is with the Opportunity Institute. Kedda, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, good afternoon or good morning. I'm in Chicago, so on Central Time. I am the Deputy Director of the Opportunity Institute, which is a nonprofit incubator that incubates and funds and supports projects that are focused on advancing education equity, in particular in the sort of pre-K through 12 and some college system. And I'm just really excited to be here today and feel really humbled to be part of this great discussion. Thanks, Zakiya.
Thank you so much, and we're honored to have you for you to be sharing your expertise with us in the world today. My next colleague is Rhonda Bryant. Rhonda, please introduce yourself to our audience.
Hi, everyone. I am Rhonda Bryant. I'm co-director of Forward Promise. We are an organization that's focused on eliminating dehumanization and racialized trauma so that boys and young men of color can heal, grow, and thrive. We do that work through grant making, technical assistance, development of leaders in community, and research. So I'm really happy to be here today. Thanks, Zakiya.
Absolutely. So excited to hear from you today as well. And certainly last but not least, my friend, my homeboy, and my colleague, Tyson Amir. Will you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Right on. I appreciate that, Zakiya. Greetings, everyone. My name is Tyson Amir. It's an honor to be here with everybody on this panel today. And I'm born and raised in the Bay Area, California, brother. I live here in Oakland, and the work that I do, I'm the author of the book Black Boy Poems, the Black Boy Poems curriculum. I am the founder and director of the Black Literary Collective. I'm also the founder and director of Freedom Soul Media Education Initiatives. And we do all that we can do to organize our people and create revolutionary, liberatory focused education programs that will inspire the people to continue to work for their freedom and liberation. So thankful to be here. I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to it. Let's make it happen.
Yes, yes, that's exactly what we want to provide today, especially in this moment in time, you know, in our history. As all of you know, we are witnessing, to me, what are inspiring uprisings, not just in the United States, but literally across the world. And so each and every one of you have been doing critical work, planting seeds for what we now see in the streets. I want to encourage audience participation. Please, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, put them down in the comments section. We really want this to be interactive. We really want you guys to feel very involved in this conversation. And so now I want to segue to my first topic, and I'll bring up my colleague Chris again, who I have the honor to work with at the Brightbeam Network. And we want to provide sort of a historical context, right? We want to really think about, where we've been, situating it also in this current moment, and where we are looking to go. And so, Chris, before we dive in to this discussion about COVID-19, its impacts and solutions, I want to make sure that we're situating today's conversation in our ongoing fight for racial and social justice in this country. Mm-hmm. With that in mind, I would like to lift up the names of the people who have lost their lives to police murder and brutality in our country. And I'll lift up some names that I've personally fought for, having lived in the Dayton, Ohio region for 20 years. I want to lift up the name of Jamar McShann, who was murdered by the Marine Police Department several years ago. He was the son of a very good friend of mine, someone that I helped support around education justice. And I want to lift up the name of Jamar Clark, lift up the name of Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, and so many others. Of course, George Floyd. Chris, I would love to hear your reflections, right? I'm not sure if you shared, but we can share with the audience that you are a citizen of the state of Minnesota and lived in the Twin Cities for many years. We would love to just know, what's happening. How do you connect what's happening now to Brightbeam's education justice advocacy work? Can you share that with our audience?
Sure. Well, it's good that you started by lifting up names of people that we need to remember to make sense of the moment that we're in right now. Minneapolis, actually going back to 1968, has had problems with racial equity in the police departments. Even before then, but definitely in 1968 is a time when Minneapolis burned before. There were riots here before, and there were promises of change. There were promises that there would be new policies and programs and a new way for the city to work with communities of color, specifically Black communities. That didn't work. It didn't happen. And what we're seeing today, I think, is evidence that these things happen in cycles and we have to keep coming back to them and we have to keep demanding justice, and the fight never will end. I moved to Minneapolis in 1987. In 1990, there was a name we should lift up. Tyson Nelson was a young man, 17-year-old in Minneapolis, who was shot in the back multiple times. The official story was that he had been shot because he was lifting a gun and threatening police officers. And as it turns out, he was running away. And he was leaving a party, running away. He was scared, and he was shot in the back. The officer, Dan May, who did that, actually got a medal from the Police Officers Union. That's in 1990. So that is, almost 30 years ago.
Right.
That Tyson did. We're talking about George Floyd today. We could talk about Jamar Clark just a couple of years ago. We could talk about Philando Castile. We have so many names that we can keep talking about. But what's different right now, what we have seen with George Floyd, is it touched a nerve that can't be stopped. People now know that Minneapolis has been a progressive center of inequity for a long time, but now it's national, and as you said, it's global. And we should take advantage of this moment while the cities are still burning to demand justice in a new way, not just in policing, but in all the systems that support healthy communities, all the systems that serve our children, and all the systems that serve Black people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for lifting up those names. Thank you for providing the historical context. We oftentimes don't hear of all of the names of people who have been victims of police brutality and murder. And I think that historical context sort of, gives the audience a context for why Minneapolis is literally burning, and so people can know that this has been decades of injustice that people have been living with. You know, you talked about also not just talking about the police, but all the institutions that intersect and impact what we're talking about, child justice. And I would love for you to just share, you know, with our audience, you know, there's a report that Brightbeam released in January called The Secret Shame. Can you share a little bit more about that report and its context? And also, it was a pre-COVID. How do you think, in terms of that report, how do you think things will either improve or not improve in this post-COVID moment?
Well, on that one, I think where everything became more challenging. So any problem that we would have talked about 6 months ago is just on steroids now. Everything will be more challenging in the COVID and post-COVID era for us. The report actually came out of the fact that I was traveling so much to many different cities, talking to families, students, and parents, educators about their schools and about their educational experiences. And I was also bringing information to them about their communities on those schools. And I saw a pattern that was happening over and over and over again. I would go from one city to the next that was experiencing a lot of prosperity, booming economy, cranes everywhere, condos popping up, extolling the virtues of the great lifestyles that they had in those cities. And in each of those cities, I could tell you that there were kids that were the faces at the bottom of the well, kids living on the margins of all the prosperity, who were never going to be set up to live and enjoy the real mainstream lifestyle of these prosperous, glowing cities. And that was a problem for me. And I wanted to see whether or not it was a problem that I was just seeing anecdotally from like Seattle to San Francisco and Austin and Minneapolis, many progressive cities, or was it a trend? And we did the research that basically said that progressive cities have a particular problem, especially with Black and brown children, especially with achievement. We had to wonder, how could that be in cities where the economy is doing so well, there's money, there's opportunity all around, and you still can't get it right. San Francisco was a burning example. San Francisco is the wealthiest county in California, probably wealthier than most places on planet Earth. And Black male students and Black students in that city, in that district, that school district, were doing the worst of anywhere in California. We couldn't get our mind around the fact how you could be wealthy, college educated, progressive, have all the values in all of your municipal government that you would think would be a boon for us. You could have all that and still be doing very poorly with Black and brown students. And that's where the report came from.
Yeah, that's that's certainly not the narrative that we often hear about progressive cities, and how a lot of these cities have even hired marketing companies to promote themselves, and we see now rampant gentrification that's displacing. I'm here in the Washington, D.C. region, and I know that's the case for D.C., where longtime residents are being displaced. But of course, D.C. has marketed itself as, one of the most progressive cities. It's all kinds of things to do. But then when you look at the data, and you see how Black students are doing and compared, to their white counterparts, it's really abysmal. And I just appreciate that the report shined a light, right, on these places who have marketed themselves as the place to be. And it just begs the question: the place to be for who, right?
Right.
Yeah, the place to be for who. In terms of COVID, we're in this moment now. We saw that all of those opportunity gaps and education debt, really, right? Achievement gaps, all of those different things in progressive cities. Our work with our activists, in Oakland, we've been calling for, this remedy to a digital divide. How do you see, our work going forward, in this moment, not just even with this pandemic, but now, just with the ongoing racial and social injustice that we know all of our kids are absorbing?
So it's a great question. I mean, one part of that question that we have to answer right away, there's a 68-point gap between Black and white students in Washington, D.C. There's a 58-point gap between white and Black students in places like San Francisco. And that was bad when you had kids in school every day in the hands of teachers and educators trying to teach them. With COVID, we have a large number of missing students. We have inequitable access to the internet and the systems that people need, the platforms that parents need to get their kids on. So we are worried about a COVID slide. We're worried about the fact that during this time right now, we know for sure right now it's the kids of color that are actually going to lose the most progress and have the most to lose during this time. And if it's hard for education systems to educate kids in good times, it's going to be even harder now that it's so uncertain of when we'll get back to school, if we'll get back to school, what resources are being offered to parents. And it's even things so simple as access to the internet being a right, not being a luxury. There is no place in the United States where having access to the internet isn't germane to finding and locating jobs and housing and getting an education. So the idea that we would have even cable companies who offer free internet, but have a little disclaimer in there that few people talk about, that they don't give it to any families that had previous bills that they didn't pay, for instance. So people who were really struggling would be the ones who would be left out of that. All of these type of things that support education and the well-being of children are all going to be in question now. And it's not going to be for a minor tweak. We're going to have to be very vigilant about calling for a major reset on the way that we support children in the cities.
Thank you, Chris. We have a few more minutes, in this segment, and I'd love to hear, just what are some, based on what, we just heard from you, we just heard about, all the challenges during this time. Mm-hmm. What are some of the solutions? How can we share with our parents and audience members who are listening right now, what are some things that they can be doing right now to mitigate some of those harms? Should we be putting pressure on our local school boards, on our mayor and our and the institutions that are responsible to its citizens? And are there other things that parents and community members can be doing in their own communities to support one another? Can you share just some bright spots about what people can be doing during this time?
Before the onset of COVID, we were saying that community members needed to demand more of their leaders. They needed to put pressure on the people in every city that were responsible for the well-being of children, specifically because that's our focus. And what we found in place after place after place is we found mayors who were washing their hands of their responsibility to really support all the children in their jurisdiction. We found mayors that cared a lot about the business community and about real estate developers, but to a much lesser extent, took the responsibility for making sure that the educational, academic well-being of their children were being taken care of. And it was hard for us to understand how you could be a mayor who stands up and say, we have a world-class city when none of the kids in your city can read, right? None of the Black and brown kids are having a good experience in your schools. So what we were saying then was people needed to put pressure on their leaders to convene the major stakeholders of their cities, marshal all of their resources, create a body of work that they could put into a plan that would be community owned and community monitored for year-over-the-year progress of what was happening with the kids in their city. A place like Minneapolis needs a plan for how it's going to do better year over year with the Black, brown, and Native American students of Minneapolis. They don't have one right now. And they definitely don't have one that involves the community holding them accountable for progress. So that was one of the things that we thought was the main lever. We couldn't demand what programs they should have. We shouldn't be prescriptive about what remedies they should take because every community is different. But what should be the same in every one of those communities is the elected leaders need to lead or leave. They either need to do their job and be responsible for the outcomes of the children in their jurisdictions, or they need to leave.
I think that's powerful. I completely, obviously agree. And that's something that we should be encouraging people to do. The other thing is, I want to say really quickly before we bring our sister Nekima into this conversation, is that I've also seen an increase in homeschooling for African-American families. And I have heard from even colleagues and friends and family members who have had this time during COVID and was like, oh, I can do this. Right. Before COVID, we saw the largest increase in homeschooling was the African-American community. And there are reports that because of the institutional and systemic racism, and not being able to move things the way that they need to in institutions, parents are pulling their kids out. Is that something that could be a remedy as well for all of these things that we're fighting with these institutions to do right by Black and brown kids?
I think it's definitely a remedy for those who can do it. And we do know that Black families, Black parents of all economic statuses are the fastest growing group of homeschoolers there are in the United States. And the
Yes.
number one reason that they give for it is to protect and defend their kids against institutional racism. So whereas many white families pull their kids because of religious reasons or other reasons, the movement of Black homeschooling is coming out of a desire to protect and defend the young Black mind from institutional racism in the education system. So
Right.
I think it's positive. Here's something from COVID that I just want to point out. COVID has created a situation where the government has given us all of our kids back and said, have at it. These are your kids. You got to do something right now because we can't do much from our
Right.
perspective. I think that's going to cause a lot of families to rethink their relationship with their children, with their children's education, and with the systems that educate their kids.
Well, it sounds like we got our hands cut out for us then as education advocates and organizers nationally here, and we'll be thinking about that and how to support those parents. I want to now bring in my my sister, my friend, Nekima Levy-Armstrong, who I have so much respect for. I honor you. I honor the work that you have been doing. And I want to share with our audience that Nekima is in ground zero right now. She's in Minneapolis. As my sister says, she's a civil rights attorney. She's an activist. She is the executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation, where I have an opportunity to work with her as a community activist fellow. Nekima, welcome to this broadcast. And I am delighted that you are here to share your expertise and a firsthand account for what's happening currently on the ground there in Minneapolis as a response to our brother George Floyd's murder by the Minneapolis Police Department. Can you just share a little bit for our audience who may want to know a firsthand account? What's happening?
Well, thank you, Zakiya, for having me and for all of my esteemed colleagues who are a part of this discussion. I want to give a shout out to all the people right now who are here in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities who are watching this. And I think that this town hall is a welcome break from all of the stress and trauma and turmoil that we are experiencing here. And it's really the result of our elected officials not listening to us years and years ago. We started taking to the streets shortly after the uprising that happened in Ferguson, Missouri in August of 2014 after Mike Brown was killed by police. We started marching in November of 2014 and shutting things down and demanding justice and putting forward policy recommendations, and we never stopped. So our energy has been consistent, and that's part of why you see the uprisings here that have happened, us continuing to take to the streets, things happening around the nation and around the world of people standing in solidarity with us and also demanding justice in their own jurisdictions. So I think that one of the things that is important to think about with regard to this discussion on child justice is that when we're talking about the police and we're talking about the educational system, we're talking about twin systems that have played a role in oppressing Black people since those institutions were founded. When you look at the public education system, it goes all the way back to during the days of enslavement of African peoples, where it was a crime for enslaved Africans to even learn how to read, to become educated. People had to develop their own systems, on plantations to try to learn how to read and to teach their children how to read. Frederick Douglass, for example, born into slavery, became one of the most prolific writers and speakers on behalf of the African-American community, had to trick his slave master so that he could learn how to read and be, who we see him as in our history. And so when you look at the current system of public education, it's very similar to policing, because you have people who don't look like us or our children coming in and teaching our children. They don't live in the community. They don't even send their kids a lot of times to the schools that they teach in. And they tend to relegate our children to subpar academic institutions. And then we wonder why we have some of the social issues that happen in our community. It is a form of social engineering that is happening through our public education system. So in Minnesota in particular, you know, it has a fake reputation, as Chris alluded to, as being a land of progressivism and liberalism and volunteerism. The isms go on and on. But when you dig more deeply and you look behind the facade of Minnesota Nice, what we see are Black and brown children being at the bottom in terms of their academic progress and their proficiency rates. We have some schools with single-digit proficiency rates in reading and math, which is simply unconscionable, given how wealthy this state is, given how many Fortune 500 companies are here, and how many people consider themselves to be do-gooders, right? But if we go back to Dr. King's 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail, he talks about, look, you know, yeah, we look at the Ku Klux Klanners, we look at the white supremacists and you know, folks perpetuating hate crimes, but the real people we have to also look at are the so-called good people, because the silence of the good people is actually deadly for Black people. And there are a lot of folks who are working in these academic institutions who are perpetuating the status quo for our children.
Amen.
And so we're outraged here in terms of the inadequate system of education. And again, the parallels to the system of policing, where we have a lot of mostly white male cops who don't live anywhere near the city of Minneapolis, having authority over Black bodies in the city of Minneapolis, coming into communities that are already politically disenfranchised, economically disenfranchised, and being able to have control and authority over us, misusing their authority, misusing the law, which is already set up to work in their favor. And it causes us to feel like we're under siege in our own communities. And
Right.
It also causes us to be in survival mode, which again has a lot of consequences when people have enough of, you know, this system and the people who run these systems having their knees on our necks, right? And so
Right.
what you've seen here is just an uprising related to extreme frustration and too many pressure points being pushed in the Black community, and people simply being fed up and saying this whole system needs to change.
That's right. The whole damn system is guilty. That's what you just laid out so beautifully. You know, thank you again for all the work that you have been doing. I'm happy to work with you in the capacity at Brightbeam, and I'd love for you to share just a couple of more things that you and I have been working on recently. And I know that you did some actions with the school board around what they framed as an equity plan. Can you share a little bit more about that and what that work was about?
Absolutely. And so, you know, everyone knows we're in the midst of a global pandemic still, even though the current actions of the police, past actions of the police, caused us to put our health in jeopardy to take to the streets and march and demonstrate. So
Right.
while we were already dealing with that, Minneapolis public schools showed that they lack sensitivity, which we already knew, but it was exacerbated by the fact that they created a plan that they called an equity plan for the Minneapolis school children. And really, it's a disaster in the making. We don't know what the new normal is going to look like after we emerge from the impacts of COVID-19. We don't know what school budgets are going to look like. And yet, Minneapolis Public Schools put in place a plan that's going to shift many boundary lines, that's going to change some schools that were K-8 to K-5 schools, which is really impacting our children who speak English as a second language and families who've experienced trauma, who want to keep their children together. High school boundary lines are going to change. And equity is really an afterthought in this particular plan that's known as the CDD, the Comprehensive District Design Plan. And so I worked with many parents to organize. We had a petition that we put in place that had over 3,000 signatures. We did a car caravan in front of the school system. We did everything in our power to get the attention of school board members to say, nothing about us without us. You can't put forward a plan like this and not include the voices of the most impacted community members. So I think it's a disaster in the making. I can understand why so many Black parents are now homeschooling their children, because they're fed up with their children being taught a Eurocentric curriculum that does not relate to our real world circumstances as Black people, our history, and how we overcome white supremacy and oppression. So we have fought back. We will continue to fight back and continue to stand our ground. And one other thing that I will add, so back when I was a law professor, I taught law for 14 years. During that period of time, I ran a civil rights legal clinic, and one of our issues was education justice. Several years ago, we started demanding an end to the school to prison pipeline, asking many public schools to remove police officers from the school system because of their violent nature and history. But did the school district listen to us? Absolutely not. They gave every excuse in the book why they needed to keep cops in school. But once they saw the brutal murder of George Floyd that we all witnessed on video, suddenly they can find the time, the energy, and the resources to remove cops from school. Why does it take something as extreme as a murder of a Black man caught on video for elected officials to do the right thing by us and our children? Think about all the kids who have been criminalized over the years who will never get that time back, the time they spend in the juvenile system, or the education that they lost back as a result of horrible policies by those who have signed up to elect and serve but are not thinking about the people. Enough is enough.
Enough is enough. Perfect timing. I want to encourage everyone who is watching, please, post your comments, and post your questions and comments in our comment section, and we promise we will get to them. Nekima, thank you so much for sharing and giving us that context of what's happening currently on the ground and sharing. So I am now happy to bring in my colleagues, Kedda Williams and Rhonda Bryant, who are going to talk a little bit more about, what can we be doing now in this moment, and what can we be doing as we move forward. And so, Kedda, I want to bring you in, as someone who has worked at the district, state, national, and federal levels in education as a consultant, government employee, and now a nonprofit leader. How would you frame the inequities in education system today, especially in this so-called new normal, or temporary new normal, as I would call it, with COVID-19, and how that presents a layered response in this ongoing fight for racial and educational justice in this country? Can you share with us?
Thank you, Zakiya, and thank you so much for that setup, Chris and Nekima. So part of my role in this conversation is really to provide a bit of that background and context for the structural inequities that we have seen in our system to date, and sort of look at what we can learn about the work that actually really needs to happen, especially in this moment. I'm going to be talking pretty fast because there's a lot to get through. So I think we can all agree that we have seen chronic disinvestment in schools and communities for a very long time. And it's important to understand that underfunding and inequitable funding isn't by accident. It's a set of clear policy choices and decisions that result in chronic disinvestment in Black and brown and poor schools and school communities. So we're talking about school buildings and infrastructure, we're talking about materials, we're talking about educators and support staff, and on and on and on. So while these inequities have kind of more recently been exposed and are kind of new for some of those who've been living in somewhat of a bubble, advocates and civil rights organizations and community organizers, including those on this particular town hall, have been fighting forever on these issues around achievement and opportunity gaps in education, health disparities, food insecurity, lack of technology access. So with the recent protests against police brutality stemming from anti-Black racism, we see many of these same organizations continuing the push for ideas like counselors and not cops, and defunding school resource officers, and essentially trying to make the case that certain resources need to be redirected and reallocated in a way that best serves our young people if they're going to have any chance at not just surviving, but actually thriving in this country. So it's not just about increasing funding, although this is a big part of the equation, but the need to actually make different choices about how that funding actually hits communities. So we know that significant resources will be needed after all that our young people have experienced over the past month, layered on top of all of the existing trauma that they experienced by being Black or brown or poor in America. And this really is a moment for us to be inspired by what's possible. We really can't proceed forward with a scarcity mindset when we try to do that reimagining work, as my friend and activist, the other Zakiya Sankara-Jabar rightly says. There are enough resources out there, and our young people deserve it all, and we have to believe that. So let's take a step back now and briefly explore why school funding is inequitable and reflect on what we learned from some of our prior crises like the Great Recession and what that tells us about what we are likely to experience in this moment in history. So some of you may know, many of you may know that on average, in terms of the breakdown of funding, 47% of K-12 education funding comes from state revenue, which is largely income taxes and sales taxes. And local governments provide about 45%, and the federal government plugs that remaining hole of around 8%. Because schools depend on state funding for about half of their revenue on average, they have to drastically cut spending when states actually provide less, especially when local districts can't cover those gaps. So the most at risk in moments like these, and what we saw in the Great Recession, are districts that are poor and Black and brown, and they all share a commonality in their funding, in the sense that they have half of their revenue come from this very unpredictable state aid. Right. So when state revenue actually collapsed, when all of us went into quarantine mode, and most of business activity actually shut down, the districts are going to actually see, not necessarily this past year that we're still just wrapping up now, it's the upcoming school year, 2020-21, when leaders are going to need to expect state revenue shortfalls to hit district budgets. And when we look back at the Great Recession, cuts were made immediately following the recession to K-12 funding, in addition to other areas like healthcare and human services. And it took years for states to restore their funding to pre-recession levels. And some states that actually had cut really deeply after the recession hit are still providing much less support, including states like Arizona and Oklahoma. We're just gonna go ahead and call them out. Emergency aid from the federal government at that time did prevent even deeper cuts, but that money ran out before the economy even recovered, and states chose to address their budget shortfalls disproportionately through spending cuts, rather than thinking about things like a mix of cuts and increasing taxes, for example.
Defunded.
Even when revenue began to rebound, Zakiya, many states enacted massive tax cuts that still deprived state governments of revenue they needed to increase education spending. So what we've seen is that local funding still hasn't fully recovered, leaving total state and local K-12 funding per student still well below pre-recession levels, even at this time. Many of you are aware the CARES Act came and went, and now we're looking at trying to get additional funds from the feds. CARES Act brought $13.5 billion to school districts, but they will not be able to make up for anticipated losses even with that money. And without another federal bailout, which isn't looking so great, still Congress going back and forth, Republicans want to understand the justification for giving more and put additional rules behind it. The prediction for folks who live and breathe this type of work every day is that states are going to actually have to cut between 5 and 25% from their budgets. So we know that budget cuts mean school resource impacts. And we know that economic downturns like the Great Recession don't affect all students equally. In general, students in wealthy school districts that can rely more on local sources of revenue like property taxes, they're going to be good. But those districts and schools that rely heavily on state aid, that in turn, those states rely heavily on income and sales taxes that aren't coming through and weren't coming through in during the Great Recession, will essentially be screwed. So we also know another thing about times like these is that learning impacts, right, are going to occur. And learning impacts that are connected directly to lost jobs, to related depression, anxiety, trauma, stress on both the students and the parents and families. Research on the impacts from the Great Recession showed that test scores generally declined in those districts serving those most vulnerable students, which means Black, brown, poor. The Great Recession, like COVID-19, exacerbated existing inequities with respect to outcomes for different groups of students. Teachers that were cut 10 years later were able to see that the achievement gaps persist. We also can't forget the fact that the housing crisis that occurred, right, means intense mobility and related instability as a result. And to Chris's mention about this idea of a COVID slide, researchers and policymakers are literally talking about this right now. Their current predictions are that in the fall of 2020, kids will have come into school with roughly 70% of the learning gains in reading that they should have had in a typical year. And in math, they could be as small as 50% of the learning grades, right? Children from more affluent communities are more likely to come from families with financial resources and have that more stability in employment. They can work from home and generally get past this moment relatively untouched, okay? Of course, we know there are outliers there. But when you talk about our students, the most vulnerable students and young people whose families work in low-paying fields, who are gonna be hit higher, right? Food insecurity, family instability, these are the ones that we're really looking at and really, really, really worried about. And we're actually hearing from parents now about what their concerns are in this COVID-19 world. A group called Parent Amplifying Voices in Education, PAVE, which many of you may have heard of, out of DC, a group that I respect so much. They interviewed a diverse group of DC parents, diversity in geography and race and ethnicity and all the things. They asked them, what has been challenging for you during this time? How has COVID-19 impacted your family? The key takeaways: COVID-19 has had a disproportionate impact on DC's poorest and most vulnerable. No surprise there. Those who are already low income are struggling with meeting basic needs, and it's causing a ton of stress and anxiety. Parents are especially worried about being able to work, making sure their families stay healthy and have access to care for pre-existing conditions and cleaning supplies, and that their kids are taken care of at home. So now I want to shift the conversation slightly. Like, let's talk a little bit about how we develop the solutions needed in this moment, which will be kind of the second half of this town hall, right? So one thing that we know for sure is that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, okay? We really need to make sure that we are centering the people, the most vulnerable people, in the solutions, okay? A new education agenda, whatever it looks like, has to be rooted in the idea of opportunity for all and have equity and access at the center of that. So when we talk about the systems level, schools and districts and states, all of those folks need to be partnering with community-based organizations and family and youth organizers to actually reimagine education in the fall and beyond. But I would be remiss if I didn't note that reimagining doesn't necessarily mean recreating the wheel. We know that many of the community organizers and organizations, all of them for that matter, have been working decades on this work, right? So how can we really lift that up in these spaces and in these conversations as well? The other side of this, in terms of engagement and centering the people, and a group that we don't always talk about, is philanthropy. Y'all just heard me set up the financial situation here. So public-private partnerships are more important during this time than I think they've ever been, right? And so philanthropy as well has to be guided and informed by the reimagining work, which is really coming from a deep and authentic place. Decision-making has to be done in a participatory way. Everyone needs to be engaging in this and making decisions in a way that's collaborative. And we can't
Absolutely.
Communities and the young people that we serve. And I think to think otherwise, to be honest, really perpetuates a sort of elitist academic mindset that is really white supremacy and institutional racism. You weren't ready for that.
That's right.
So yeah.
That's a good segue.
But it's true. And when I say that, I'm not specific to education, unique to education.
That's right.
I'm talking about all the sectors. This is also not unique to white people, right? So
unfortunately,
we all need to really get serious about this and the work that's happening. And I do just want to highlight and flag my friends at Communities for Just Schools Fund, because there are examples of philanthropy, public-private partnerships.
Yes, those are my friends too.
Yes, they are. I was going to just say they work with youth, family, and community organizers, including you, Zakiya, to come up with concrete recommendations and a roadmap for fostering safe and positive school climates by doing things like investing in restorative justice and culturally relevant curricula and practices that you're going to hear more from Tyson, Amir, diverse teaching and support staff, and on and on and on. Okay, so we just want to make sure that we are lifting up the people that are doing this work, also the organizations that are also trying to do better at doing this work. And this really is a call to action, right, in this moment. Reverend Lennox Yearwood of the Hip Hop Caucus, some of you may be familiar with him, is often heard saying the phrase, demonstration without legislation leads to frustration. And that
is so true.
In this moment, Zakiya.
Yes.
Communities need to feel inspired by what's possible, and the solutions have to be transformative, or else what are we really doing here? And honestly—
Thank you so much, Kedda.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
Yep. Do I need to stop now? Because I had a little—
Yeah, I'm getting ready to bring in Rhonda. We got to get Rhonda in here. We got to get my sister Rhonda in here. This is wonderful. As you know, we're going to bring everybody back together shortly here. But definitely want to get my sister Rhonda in here. Rhonda, you are a leader in the education space. You are working in the boys and young men of color space movement with Forward Promise. And you guys have actually produced a framework that I actually love. And I can't wait for this audience to hear more about the 5 elements of dehumanization. When you think about that in the context of what Kedda has just talked about, which has been so much, right? You know, how would you frame that from the social determinants of health perspective?
Yeah. You know, I think the big point that I took out of Kedda's talk was what we fund and how we fund is a reflection of what and who we value in our society. And we essentially have been making decisions for decades that have been stripping away at the humanity of Black and brown people in our society with a level of intentionality that, quite frankly, has just been deplorable and disgusting. And at Forward Promise, when we talk about those 5 domains of dehumanization, there are tons of examples that we can pull up inside and outside the education space and in our communities that all speak to the ways that we need to operate differently and how we have been intentionally pulling away at the fabric of our society and not giving to our Black and brown communities the way that we should. So when we think about the first area of dehumanization, historical dehumanization, Nekima raised a few examples of how historically education has not functioned well for people of color in our society. When we begin the history lessons in our schools with the stories of slavery and colonization, and we start at the point where people are stripped of their dignity and they're oppressed, when we put up artificial roadblocks for Black educators to be able to do their work and for them to be able to move into administrative roles to run our schools, all of those are examples of the denial of the humanity of our people. When we think about cultural and spiritual dehumanization, which is another area that we talk about at Forward Promise, when we don't make room for cultural expressions or ways of learning in our schools, and when we invalidate everyone else's culture and expect that our children conform to the dominant culture when they sit in our school buildings, that's the denial of their humanity. When we look at our community infrastructure and we refuse to fix things like racial discrimination in housing, for example, we make families less stable, and that means more frequent school transitions for children. So they're unstable in terms of which school buildings they're in every day. When we cut food programs in our schools for hungry children, and at the same time, simultaneously cut access to social programs like SNAP and TANF and WIC, when we sell off our green spaces in communities to corporations and leave children with no safe spaces to play, all of those are examples of denial of humanity. And then when you couple that with living in a society where our bodies are commodified. So our children in school are desirable on the football field, on the basketball court, on the cheerleading squad, on the track team, but they're not placed in advanced placement courses. When they are not protected from being prey for the police inside or outside the school building, and then when they bear witness to racist acts from people who do us intentional harm, those are all examples of living in a society that's denying our humanity. And then finally, when emotionally they are vilified for mourning the losses of these indignities and vilified for demanding justice, those are examples of emotional dehumanization. And what we know is that all of these failures to see children of color as human sends a clear message to them that is deeply traumatizing. So when we dehumanize children in our society, we're essentially telling them your culture has no value, your community has no value, your spiritual and cultural practices are inferior, your bodies have no value, you are a threat. These messages are internalized by our young people. And we don't often talk about the profound physical and mental health implications of these messages that are so pervasive in our society. There's a lot of research in the youth development field that talks about notions of hopelessness versus hopefulness and its relationship to trauma and risk behaviors. There's also a lot of research on how racialized traumas that come out of dehumanization are connected to risk behaviors and hopelessness and health outcomes for our children. But these concepts are often not put on the table when we're talking about how do we need to shift policy and practice in our society. So we know that when children of color experience trauma because of failure to acknowledge their humanity, that we see things in them like higher levels of obesity, higher levels of stress hormones in their body, greater instances of depression, poorer sleep habits, for example. And all of those things we know are connected to their ability to achieve in school. So I think for me, the question becomes, what is the message that people who sit in positions of power and authority over our schools and our community systems want to send? What is the message? You know, and I think that people would argue that none of them want to send this message that we invalidate our children, that their bodies are threats, that their culture is bad, etc. But the policy decisions and the practices in our school buildings and in our community systems have to align with a message that says we value you, we see you, you are important, you are an asset in our community. And failure to make those policy and practice decisions is hypocritical, quite frankly. So right now we live in this society that blames people of color for their inability to thrive without actually taking accountability for the dehumanizing policies that have existed in our society for generations that essentially snatch away opportunities for children to thrive every day. But we know the solutions. The solutions are not new. They are things that we have been attempting to advance for many, many years, like Kedda mentioned earlier. You know, the activists, all of us have been trying to advance these solutions, and we've been lifting them up for years. Now that we sit in this period of COVID-19, some of these inequities are being put on major display in our society, but the solutions and what we need to be doing is abundantly clear. And now is really the time for us to take the time as policy advocates to continue to push on those messages, and for those who sit in positions of decision-making to actually listen and begin to act. And anything less than that is simply just unacceptable.
Woo! Well, you two sisters just brought the fire. We have so many comments, questions. I promise that I will get to some of your questions for all of our audience members. But thank you, Kedda and Rhonda, for really contextualizing and framing up, you know, everything for us. I think that, you know, that's an excellent segue, Rhonda, that you left off on to bring in my colleague and brother, as I said, from the Bay, Brother Tyson Amir. I had the opportunity to meet Tyson at a Stanford Institute hosted by a Black Education Network, and we were both presenters at the same institute. And I fell in love with his book and his curriculum, and my son's name is also Amir, and so they had a chance to meet, and he was gifted a copy of his book. It's really a powerful work, and I believe it's an intervention in that dehumanization that Rhonda just so eloquently explained to us. And so Tyson, I just really want to, you know, just hear from you and help us understand a little bit more about your work. Can you share a little bit more about your inspiration to write this book and curriculum, and talk about some of the school districts that you're working with?
Definitely, I appreciate it, Zakiya. But first, though, I've been sitting on this call, and I've been over here going crazy off of everything that everybody before me has said. So Chris with Nekima, Kedda, and of course Rhonda right now, and then how you've been setting this up, Zakiya. We really appreciate that. This is much needed for our community. And when you're talking about inspiration, I mean, I'm sitting here right now. I'm in West Oakland, so I'm from Bay Area, born and raised. I'm from East San Jose. And I live here in Oakland, and I do a lot of work just all throughout the Bay Area. But if you know Oakland and you know where I'm at, I'm off 7th Street, right across from the BART station. So you might hear the BART in the background in my microphone. But this is significant because this land right here where I'm at, this is the birthplace of the Black Panther Party. So October 15th, 1966 was the founding of the Black Panther Party, and it was founded in West Oakland. It was founded by, of course, the Dr. Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale, but Huey P. Newton is the chief theoretician of the Black Panther Party and all of that. So when you're asking me about my inspiration and what motivates me and what has influenced or inspired the work that I've created, that's that. It's our history. And that is exactly what, when we go back to what our previous brothers and sisters were saying, our history is nowhere to be found in any of these institutional manifestations of quote unquote education. Nah. This is colonial education. This is not education for revolution. This is not education for liberation. This is not education for the development and the upliftment of a strong people. And so when it came to the book that I wrote, Black Boy Poems, and when it came to the Black Boy Poems curriculum, my focus first and foremost was to create a powerful literature and work that would be a manual that could turn into a foundation for our people to stand on in a deep understanding of our revolutionary tradition and the power that we have and how we can use that power to change our condition, because we know this society is not going to do that for us. It is on us to do that. And we're starting to see that, but we're seeing a reflection of that and what's been happening over the past couple of weeks in response to the assassination of our brother George Floyd and so many of our other brothers and sisters by the state. And so our people are rising up. Our people need to be informed as we're rising up so we can formulate more strategies and tactics to change or recreate a new situation that's going to be more just and equitable for all of us. My bad for that long answer, but I'm juiced up. I'm excited. So let's go.
Yes, so I believe you actually have a video that is going to showcase the work that you've been doing all around the state of California. And I understand that you also are working in districts outside of California, even nationally now. So I think we're going to be queuing up a video to share with our audience, and they can see some spoken word. They can see some young people who are involved. And so I'm excited about that. After the video, we're going to come back and do some reflection on that and talk about it.
Let's do it. I'm excited for the people to see it.
Dr. Huey P. Newton had an epiphany once and then said, I don't expect the white media to create positive black male images. So it begins with a quote by Huey, and then it ends with this quote up here by Malcolm. So I wrote between a Huey quote and a Malcolm quote. So everything in between those two quotes is me. So that's literally between Huey and Malcolm. All right, the piece is that there's a lot of content in it. You already know, if you were here last week, I write heavy bars. So we want to break it down. I don't waste no lines. I don't waste no words. Everything has a meaning. It has an intention. It has a purpose. So if there's something that you see and you're like, what does that mean? Why did you say that? We're going to break it down after. Okay. So we're going to take this line by line. Y'all good? Y'all ready? Yep. Okay. So this is between Huey and Malcolm. The Dr. Huey P. Newton had an epiphany once, and then he said, I don't expect the white media to create positive black male images. So he wouldn't be surprised to see how evening networks accumulate their net worth of billions off assassinating the character of our children. They objectively report the news about black lives. Matter of factly, they spin white lies that evolve into black lies about black lives because we don't matter to them only in terms of their bottom line. You see, our worth in their eyes is somewhere between felines and pigeons. Y'all, we still less than canines. Because ninjas remember how they sent that boy Mike Vick to prison, but be the color of George Zimmerman, a private citizen, and you can legally murder a nigga and walk off scot-free. But Walter Scott can't flee, and Eric Gardner can't breathe, Tyson Miller can't sleep, and Oscar Grant can't see his daughter no more. Oh no, this ain't folklore. This is so much more. 7 years ago, before that, 1619, the first time them white beings brought us to these shores. And since then, it's been all out war. You see, their strategies and their tactics have adapted. They went from de jure to de facto. Ipso facto, they tormented and attacked us to extinguish the light of black souls. Theirs is a pathological praxis rooted in a xenophobic, schizophrenic, racially insecure, culturally immature social apparatus, forcing them to concoct a reality which confers to them an unearned status of unmerited advantage to make them feel adequate. In turn, we are termed the thugs and the savages. Whole deck stacked against us, we victims of bell curves, intelligent quotient averages, recipient of jail terms, we residents in these ghetto pans labyrinths, and very few of us can survive the madness. And for those that do, them government issue bullets fly faster than light travels from the sun to our planet. That third rock from the sun. They trying to have me Malcolm in the middle. Nah, I'm Malcolm in the window, on third watch watching over our daughters and sons. Kalishnikov 47 cock for them when they come, and we know they gonna come. Because for us, this land is a Robert Kirkman graphic novel, for it feeds off the blood of our young. Y'all, we are the walking dead. Just channeling our inner Tyrese, because we ain't destined to make it past the first few letter boxes of the first few sheets. We are akin to proteins and fatty lipids in the belly of the beast. Our appendages are the meat of fleshy mango stuck in teeth to be plucked and sucked in moments after the feast. Now let that digest. Yeah. I know these words hit hard to the gut like dysentery, or hard to the brain like religious missionaries colonizing souls and minds. No matter how you reduce it, pain is the protocol. You either die and revoke your past or try to pass as something you not on that Rachel Dolezal. But y'all, we can't opt out. We can't drop out, especially when them cops is out. That index itchy when the gun come out. We go to sleep dreaming at night wishing it would all run out and be replaced by something different when the sun comes out. But the day breaks and the morning is here and we find ourselves in mourning again. And I don't want to see any more mornings where we're mourning kith and kin. So I guess it means that we back on that Malcolm again. In essence, it only means that we want one thing. We declare our right to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary. That's it. Right on. It's deep. It's heavy. It's heavy. What y'all got? What you hear? What stood out? Would you underline? Would you highlight? Let's talk about it. Okay, I got you, then I got you next. They trying to have me Malcolm in the middle. Nah, I'm Malcolm in the window. So there are a couple different schemes that I have in the piece. So the last thing that we did, the last time I was here, it was a verse from a song that I have called Tradition. This one isn't a song, but whenever I write, I love to rhyme and I love to play with the language. So I use this scheme a few different times in this piece where I'm using names of books or television shows. So Malcolm in the Middle, that's the name of a television show. I ain't never watched it. I have absolutely no idea what the show's about. But I know the title of the show, and I know it's like a comedy. You feel me? So I'm like, they trying to have me Malcolm in the middle, like on some comedy, like it's a joke, my existence. Nah, I'm Malcolm in the window, So I don't know how many of you seen, it's a very famous photo of Malcolm X. So right before his assassination, so he's killed on February 21st, a photo was taken of him where he's in his home, he's looking out the window, he has an AK-47 in his hand because he knew people were trying to come to hurt him and hurt his family. So I said, they trying to have me Malcolm in the middle. Nah, I'm Malcolm in the window on Third Watch. Third Watch is another television show. I have absolutely no idea what it was about, but I know the name of the show and it made sense in the scheme. So I'm like, they trying to have me on this comedy stuff with the Malcolm in the middle. Nah, I'm Malcolm in the window. I know what my mission is. On Third Watch, I'm on watch for my community. You know what I'm saying? Trying to protect my community. You know what I'm saying? Watching over our daughters and sons. Kalashnikov 47. So when you say an AK-47, it's a Kalashnikov 47 because Kalashnikov was the name of the dude who made it, and the year that it was made was 1947. So that's why it's called an AK-47. So Kalashnikov 47, cock for them when they come, and we know they're gonna come. We still less than canines. All right, so I said we somewhere between felines and pigeons. Y'all, we still less than canines, because this is part of the answer to the question. How many of y'all in here ever heard of the young brother by the name of Michael Vick? Anybody in here familiar with Michael Vick? All right, go ahead, Victor, tell me. Professional football player. Probably one of the most popular athletes in the United States of America, maybe even the world at the time that we're talking about. So he went to Virginia Tech, played football there, was drafted by the Atlanta Falcons. And then while he was a star football player for the Atlanta Falcons, he ends up with the situation involving canines. Anybody know what happened with him and canines? So he was doing some dog fighting. A lot of people fight dogs. I'm certainly not saying that's the right thing to do. Mike Vick was fighting dogs. And so there was this big investigation, federal investigation. The federal government got involved in following Michael Vick. Said that you were wrong for fighting dogs, mistreating these dogs, having some of these dogs killed. So because of that, you're gonna go to prison. So Mike Vick, it would be, and I'm certainly not wishing this on the brother, but like probably the most popular, who would you say is the most popular male athlete right now? All right, so somebody said Patrick Mahomes. You said LeBron. Let's rock with LeBron. So it would be the same thing as if LeBron James right now, if something happened to him and he got sent to prison, it would be the exact same thing. I mean, let's think about that. A dude this powerful, this popular, ending up with a case, in this case sending him to prison. That was Michael Vick a few years ago for dogs. So then I said, because ninjas remember how they sent that boy Mike Vick to prison, but be the color of George Zimmerman. Who's George Zimmerman? Y'all know who he is? George, he did what? So George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin. So George Zimmerman killed Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman was not an officer, and it doesn't justify it if he was an officer. But he just a regular white dude. And he had called the police saying, I see this kid walking through the neighborhood. The police said, leave the boy alone. Multiple times they said, leave the boy alone. He goes out of his house, creates this conflict with Trayvon Martin, kills him, so he kills a human being. Kills an unarmed, innocent kid. Did George Zimmerman go to prison? He didn't go to prison at all. Matter of fact, he's suing the family of Trayvon Martin right now because he's claiming that they have defamed him. They have like desecrated his reputation. He killed their son, and now he's trying to sue their family for that. Mike Vick, the most popular athlete probably at that time, mistreats dogs, goes to prison for killing dogs. George Zimmerman kills a black kid. Nothing happens to him, and then turns around and sues the family of the kid that he killed. This is America. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I put that in there. Like when we begin to break down and really piece out what's being said, the comparison between those two, it's so extreme, but it's the norm for where we exist. It's crazy. It's crazy. Amazing day. Amazing session. So today is February 20th, 2020. We're just wrapping up here at Langston Hughes Academy in Stockton, California, Aspire Charter School Network, and we did the second edition of the Black program, Building Leaders and Activists with Collective Knowledge, with the students here at Langston Hughes Academy. Phenomenal. We talked about Dr. Huey P. Newton, Brother Malcolm X, using Between Huey and Malcolm from the Black Boy Poems book, the Black Boy Poems curriculum, went down. Young folks going crazy, asking questions, critical thinking, engaging with the content, bro. We had so much fun in there. I mean, to see young people engage from the beginning of the session to the end of the session, we was in there for maybe almost 2.5 hours, non-stop, powerful. Letting folks be inspired by their history, by their tradition, by their culture, but then most importantly, seeing what that means to them so they can see the power that they have in themselves to give life to that tradition, that history, that culture in the present day, to then begin to create change for their community. That's what we're about. So if you want this, bring the Black program, bring the Black Boy Poems curriculum, we gotta do it. We gotta do it for the people, we gotta do it for the community. Power to the people.
Wow. Well, that was a very, very powerful representation for the interventions, that people like you, Tyson, have been creating and working directly in school systems to challenge dehumanization of our children, of our communities. And I thought it was so appropriate, the connections you made in this particular video, situating it almost, with what we're dealing with now, and bringing up the injustices and the dehumanization of Black men, but Black people, writ large. Can you share a little bit more for our audience about, how, I'll tell you what I'd like to know, how easy or difficult has it been for you to get this kind of materials and curriculum into school districts? And can you share a little bit about the districts that you're working in?
Yeah, not a problem. Thank you for that. So what I have tried to prioritize from the very beginning when it came to the book and the curriculum was to get this into the Black community. So this is a work that has been supported by the Black community. And with that, I knew that strategically I'd be able to find ways to leverage that support to make sure that school districts wouldn't say no. And I'm not that, I just don't come from that mentality of asking people to do something for me. I'm gonna let them know this is the reality of the situation. This is what y'all need to do. I have this, make the space, we in here. And so once the book came out, so I published the book on the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party, so October 15, 2016. But when I published the book, I knew I was gonna make a curriculum for it because I knew the book was a very powerful educational resource. And I wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to be able to use it regardless of where they wanted to use it. So if they wanted to use it in an existing colonial education system, all right, cool. You're gonna get some revolutionary information for our young people though. If you wanna use it in the homeschool network, if you wanna use it in the community, if you wanna use it for political education, it can serve all those purposes at the same time. So the conversation that I started having with school districts, I just let them know. Black Boy Poems, the Black Boy Poems curriculum, it is content standard aligned for California. It is Common Core standard aligned as well. So if that's something that gives it more value in your mind because it fits some arbitrary fabricated educational standard, all right, cool. That's not what I necessarily care about, but we can take it there and then we can validate it in those terms. What I care about is the fact that this is a revolutionary educational approach that's going to teach young people about who they are, where they come from, and more importantly, how they're supposed to be applying that information that they learn to create revolutionary change in their community. Because, I mean, we've talked so much about the problems. This system is not going to change unless we do something about that. And this system is not teaching us how to do something about it. So we have to create a different education program that is going to be focused on that. And so being from the Bay Area, and not that like I'm claiming this over any other part of the United States. I mean, this is just colonial territory off top. But our people, regardless of where we've been, have always practiced resistance and self-defense in every institution that they've created. And so through education, we can do the same thing. And so I just come from a community that has practiced revolutionary educational philosophies. And I wanted to make sure that that was going to be presented to our young people in a way that was culturally relevant for 2020, 2021 and beyond. And so because I hit the people with the bars, I mean, the bars go hard, right? And the bars contain so much information and more folks want to know about it. So then it creates a foundation for this deeper educational conversation. And so the districts have been open to it, but even if they're not open to it, we're still going to build this stuff and we're still going to get it to our community. And so what I've been doing more recently, we have an online platform for the Black Boy Poems curriculum, which you saw in the video was the Black program. And I love saying that, the Black program, building leaders and activists with collective knowledge. That thing goes so hard, right? And so it's based on Black Boy Poems, the book, Black Boy Poems curriculum, and then other information that we bring in. And so schools are using it, and I'm thankful for that. But if they're not using it, that's okay, because we're not relying on them. We're going to get it to the community regardless. So we have independent schools that are using it. We have homeschool networks that are using it. And we got folks that are just, man, I love how this is. I'm bringing people to the house, or we just going to talk about it at the park or wherever we're at. And we're going to use the book and we're going to use the curriculum to get our young people the information that they need.
This is so inspirational, right? And I love that you lifted up, we have a history of resistance. We have a history of doing exactly what you've done with your creativity to create this book. You've created the curriculum. You have literally given the state not to have one reason why they should not include this curriculum. You've made it align to California standards, to these Common Core standards. It's amazing. And thank you. You know, as I mentioned earlier, my son has a copy of it, and you and I a couple of days ago had a little chat session. I told you, I said, well, I don't think Amir has read it yet. And he overheard me and said, hey, I have read his book. Don't tell him I haven't read his book. So this is a good segue to bring in all of our colleagues back. We're welcoming Chris back. We're going to welcome Kedda back. We're welcoming Nekima back. We are going to welcome Rhonda back, and we're going to have everybody back. And as I promised our audience, continue to post questions away. We're going to get to some of your questions. But before we do that, can we just have a round of reflections just from our panel here and what you heard from our colleague Tyson, and what you guys think about that video? And we can start with Chris.
I think it's very powerful work. I'm blown away by everything that I'm hearing today from everybody. First of all, I just want to say that there's so much powerful information in what is being discussed right now that I'm just blown away. Tyson's part of this, I think, is very important, because I just did a show this morning on Black men being erased from the educational landscape. The Black male erasure in public education is real. So to see somebody like Tyson, who has taken it in his own hand, written a book, written curriculum, is getting in the schools, is being seen and heard directly by the kids that need to see more of that, is amazing. I'm just blown away.
Same. Nekima, what'd you think?
I have to agree 100%. And I think just seeing Tyson's strength, his unapologetic Blackness, is why they're trying to erase Black men from public education. They don't know how to handle Black men who stand 10 toes down, back straight, speaking the truth in the spirit of our ancestors. But that's what our kids are hungry for, period. And we have to advocate for what our children need to see in the classrooms. They don't need more white women trying to indoctrinate them and teach them who they are. That's part of why some of them act out, because they're rejecting what is happening in the classroom. And frankly, I don't blame them. So thank you, Tyson, for bringing your intellectual property to the table, your knowledge and the spirit of our ancestors. It's 100% true. Appreciate you, brother.
Right on, appreciate you. And what you said though, we got to stay 10 toes down on that thing. We got to be unapologetic, and it is intellectual property because we've created it and we own it. You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't, Prentice Hall and all these other curriculum content providers, we don't know them. We don't care about them. They don't care about us.
Right.
We got to create our own content, because as Kedda was saying, like, we are the ones who are the closest to, we live in the middle of this madness. You know what I'm saying? Our ancestors have given us formulas for how we can navigate this, get out this, not just survive, but thrive and then create new revolutionary alternatives to what we see. So we have to be the ones at the forefront of creating this and then bringing it to our community. So I mean, that's what we're doing.
That's
So yes,
exactly
it is
right.
intellectual property. We own this madness. Let's go.
That's right. And absolutely, Nekima, when you talk about the young people who, you know, rebel, my children are two rebellious children. So my son was one of those students who absolutely rebelled, you know, the Eurocentric violent curriculum and, you know, his, you know, schools who were filled with overwhelmingly white female teachers. It's so real, and I'm glad that we're having a real conversation about it. I certainly want to get to Kedda and Rhonda, their reflections on the video. Kedda, can you share?
Yeah, sure. I mean, everything that was said, I second and third it. I would just add that just in connection to some of what Nekima was talking about and what I was sharing around the community-centered solutions to these problems, Tyson is just the perfect example of that. And really, the collective we, the we's that are working in policy and you know, all of these different areas need to figure out how we are going to learn from, listen to the Tysons of the world and actually lift up that work as well, just as we would the Prentice Halls and others. And so that's kind of what's in my head right now in terms of the type of organization that I work in and the different spaces and places that I tend to play in from an education perspective. So thank you, Tyson.
Absolutely. Rhonda.
You know, Tyson, you are doing transformational healing work. That is what you're doing. You are healing and undoing generations of racialized trauma and the impacts on our young people by standing up and being present and giving them this knowledge and truth. And we have to be doing more of that all across our communities. You know, we have to be sharing that intellectual property, like Nekima said, because that's the healing work that has to happen to raise up a new generation of young people that are unashamed to put their feet to the fire in this liberation movement. And so I'm blessed to even have been able to engage with you for this panel and want to make sure we stay connected.
Likewise, that's a mutual thing. And what you just said, Rhonda, it reminded me of, and my bad for like putting so much of the of Dr. Huey P. Newton out there, but a thing that he said, so he had an essay that he put forth in 1972 called The Technology Question. And the way that he started it off, I think really fits what you were just saying. He said, knowing how to struggle is the essence of winning. Recognizing ills is fundamental. Recognizing how to overcome ills is mandatory. So when you're talking about it's healing work, we keep sending our young people to these colonial educational institutions that traumatize, re-traumatize, continue to perpetuate the pain and the problems. And then we don't have anything else. Or we do have some of these alternative things that we can get them to, but it's not something that we can surround our young people with as much as we want. And so if we're talking about how do we really heal, we have to do it different. We have to build and so shout out to all the independent homeschool networks, independent school networks out there that are giving our young people that revolutionary education. We have to do that if we're really sincere about we want to heal, we want to thrive, and we want to create new revolutionary opportunities for our people. We have to overcome those ills. And that's us. And so like I'm honored. I'm inspired by what we've done so far, the conversations that we've had. It is mandatory for us to stick together and to continue working because we have work to do for our people. We're not going to be on this chat and just do a whole bunch of talking now. Let's get active. Let's do it. And so if the people out there who are watching want to be connected to any of our stuff, make sure they have our information. It's easy to get Black Boy Poems, the Black Boy Poems curriculum. All of that stuff is good. We're here for you. We got to keep doing work for our community.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's actually a great segue because we actually have a treat that I want to share with the folks who are listening. Also want to encourage you to please continue to post your questions in the chat. We're about to take a segue to start answering some of those questions. So please take an opportunity to continue to engage with us. Put questions that you want asked of this illustrious panel of experts. But first, I want to share that we are offering 20 copies of the Black Boy Poems to the first 20 people who post in the comments that you would like a copy. Someone from our staff will follow up directly with you to be sure to get you a copy of that book. We also are offering 5 copies of the Black Boy Poems curriculum. We would love to give these to educators, but obviously if you are a parent, if you are a part of a homeschool network, or if you're just a part of the community and say, oh my God, you know, I just watched that video, I have to have my hands on that book. I'm gonna start something in my basement or in my backyard with young people. We wanna be able to provide, again, 20 copies of the Black Boy Poems, the book, and 5 copies of the curriculum. So that is a surprise for our audience members today. So hopefully folks are still listening and you can post in the comments, so we will do that. I also wanted to share and lift up some folks that I have worked with. As I mentioned, I live here in the DC region, and I would be remiss not to lift up the revolutionary education network called Sankofa DC, which is a homeschool collective that have been around for over 20 years, run by Monica Utsi, who's a good friend of mine. So if folks are from DC listening, get in touch with her. They have a Facebook group, and also I got to lift up my Baba Wakesa Matsimoyo down in Atlanta, who runs the Aya Educational Institute, and he says that a form of resistance and a form of self-care is fighting injustice and oppression. And so I love his work. Warrior Healer Builder, you know, you need some healing work and some resistance work, please look up Baba Wakesa Matsimoyo. So without further ado, I want to get to our first question, for this panel. And we're not going to go in any particular order. We can do popcorn style. If it resonates with you, really hop on in there. And one of the first questions that we received was, someone wanted to know, you know, in this moment of the uprisings with George Floyd and others, as we know, unfortunately, the police have continued to kill people even since George Floyd's murder. But how are we connecting, or, you know, what is your opinion on the connection between George Floyd, the police brutality, school resource officers, and the proliferation of the school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration? That's a lot. That's one of our questions. Who wants to hop in there on that one? That's a lot to unpack. Come on, Nekima. I see you ready.
Yeah, I was waiting for Kima to jump on that one.
No, y'all already know how I feel about it, so that's why I was giving other people an opportunity. But, you know, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of this has its roots in slavery. We have never reconciled our racial history in America. And you see a lot of that same energy that allowed white folks to oppress, dehumanize, and brutalize our people is still there. It's been passed on from one white generation to the next. And so that's what we see happening in these systems that were not built for us to thrive. You know, if you go back to the Dred Scott case from, I believe, 1857, and you look at the decision by the Supreme Court Justice Roger B. Taney, he says it's so clear in terms of what we're up against. He said the Negro has no rights, which the white man is bound to respect. Think about that. The Supreme Court Justice of the United States made it very clear that we have no rights, which the white man is bound to respect. So if we can understand that principle, you know, this man came from a slave-owning family, and he was speaking the truth in terms of what they believe, but it helps us understand the foundation of these systems that we are up against that have to do with social control of Black people and continuing to try to oppress and demonize us and dehumanize us. And sometimes it happens with a smile, right? It's not always as obvious and as overt as the system of slavery and Jim Crow, you know, and the other things that we're talking about, but they find ways to manipulate the laws, put laws in place to control and oppress us. And sometimes we internalize their oppression and white supremacy and abuse against us, and then we start hating our own people. you know, and we think that we're responsible for what happened to us, but we're not. And I want any educators out there listening to understand we are not responsible for the oppression that has been inflicted upon our people. We are trying to resist every step of the way, trying to teach our children to resist. And it's up to educators to turn a mirror on themselves, particularly white educators, male or female, to understand that these are your ancestors who have inflicted this harm upon us that has been passed down unto you, and you have to be the change and open the pathways up for our children to fully live out their humanity, because God granted it to them, whether white people believe it or not. We don't care. We know what God said. And so at the end of the day, it's incumbent upon us to understand all of this is interrelated: mass incarceration, policing, what's happening in our education system, what's happening in our economic system. It is all interrelated to continue to oppress us, and we got to fight back against it, period.
And Zakiya, I would just build on that a little bit to say that we have to be specific about what the tools are that are used. When we talk about white supremacy and a white supremacist structure and, you know, structural inequality, those are global terms, but they don't get specific. In Minneapolis public schools and Minneapolis Police Department, there are policies, there are union contracts, there are covenants, there are things that actually form the structures. Minneapolis, we have had multiple mayors try to rein in the police, but the police union's contract is very strong. And it's the police union's contract that gives you a lot of the problems that we have in the city. It's the same thing with the schools, the school board, the teacher's contract is problematic. The way that we elect school board members is problematic. The structure of these things are problematic for all of us, and they create material consequences. It is not our fault. To Nekima's point, it's not our fault that all of the worst performing teachers are congregated in the schools with the most Black kids and kids of color and kids in poverty in Minneapolis public schools. We didn't do that. We didn't make that happen. That's a structure. We didn't create the policy that picks up Black males out of schools and reassigns them to other schools without any due process or without telling their parents about it in some cases, and calling them administrative transfers when we don't want them in one school or another. We didn't do that. That is a policy, that is a practice of the schools in the district, right? We need to be specific about where we need to apply fire, where we need to apply heat. The Minneapolis the Minneapolis police union's contract and police union shouldn't exist. That has to be a goal. I don't care what happens in the future. They just should not exist. The fact that we have the majority of our police officers, 91%, driving in from the suburbs to police Black people in the cities is a problem. The fact that almost, an overwhelming majority of our teachers drive in from the suburbs, that's a problem. So I think actually, we need to be specific about where we should place the fire. These structures have places where we need to pay attention. Contracts, policies, systems of who gets elected and how they get there, and then how we hold them accountable when they are there.
And just really briefly, Chris, that's so right on. And this idea of being specific is really, really important. And a lot of folks are doing this work of being specific right now and have been doing that. So when we think about groups like and coalitions like the Dignity in Schools campaign, obviously, Zakiya, you know them very well in terms of the Model School Code of Conduct and all of the different work that organizers and organizations have been doing in terms of getting specific. So now it's figuring out how to then take that and use it as a real advocacy tool to make very specific asks and demands in this moment when everyone is trying to reimagine and figure out what this is going to look like. The people who are impacted know, and they can say, even if it's not in, and that's why I kind of use that term, the elitist academic mindset, it's not going to maybe be in the language or in the way that you see or think should be, whatever framework. But people are talking. It's about listening to those specifics and then figuring out how to make them work and make them actionable.
And I think too, underneath those policies, we have to be thinking about the places where case managers have flexibility and they use their racial inclinations to make decisions that are not in the best interest of our children. So for example, if a young person is taken out of school because of a police issue, and then they're funneled into the juvenile justice system. There's a point at which a case manager can decide whether or not that child is on track for juvenile incarceration, or whether they have an opportunity to participate in a community-based intervention, or whether they should not be punished at all. And those are places where the policy does not, is not the decision-making point, but that person sitting in that seat can make a determination. And we know that disproportionately our kids are funneled into into juvenile incarceration rather than given community opportunities, or rather than the whole case being thrown out because there was no merit. And so how do we also make sure that those decision-making points don't continue to happen?
That's such an amazing point too. When I think about it, it hasn't come up in this show yet, but I think it's really important to think about all the systems in which our children exist. And I don't think anyone's paying attention right now to child protection agencies and how they are doing their work. No one is paying attention to the foster care system right now to see whether or not it's ballooning, because we have so many people who are affected in families that are on the front lines in hospitality work, for instance, very feminized, very of color occupations, who sometimes are the only person that a child has as a guardian. So we are talking about one child being in multiple systems. I've said it often, we have to stop pretending like we're broke and our kids aren't worth much, because our kids are $1 million children. When you calculate all the people that are earning a mortgage on our children's back through all these different systems, it adds up to quite a bit of money and quite a bit of people living off the misery of our children. But we have to hold them all accountable. It's not just the schools. It's not just the police. It's all these systems. I mean, schools and police are using child protection as a weapon against Black families in many cases. That's got to stop.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, specifically, they're using it as a weapon against Black mothers. They know that Black mothers have less economic opportunity. Sometimes they're raising their children on their own, doing the best that they can. And then you have these systems interventions which separate families, and then they pour resources in the out-of-home placement, the juvenile system, everywhere else but for the families who need them. Right? Just like, again, everything to me goes back historically in terms of our people being promised a minimum 40 acres and a mule, even though we deserve more than that. And we being the only group that never got reparations, right? And so when we look at what's happening,
talk about it.
We try to blame the families without understanding we've been deprived of resources that our ancestors earned. We've been deprived of resources that have to do with Black women, making pennies on the dollar, even compared to white women, and even more so the disparity when comparing Black women's income to white men's income. These are things that have continued to accumulate over the decade that have a significant impact on our families. I want to give a shout out to a Black woman in the Twin Cities by the name of Khalees Houston, who worked in many of these child welfare systems and systems we're talking about. And she has used her knowledge to start fighting back and trying to snatch our children back from the system. We've gone to the legislature trying to get bills passed. She's trying to get something similar to ICWA that is supposed to protect Indian children for Black children, because again, we've had a parallel journey in this country of oppression. But it's hard for her to get legislators to actually listen and to step up, and philanthropy doesn't support her either. So all these philanthropists who are shelling out money to white organizations to try to quote unquote serve our community, you need to change your practices and understand that in our community, we know what we need. We're tired of white folks profiting off of our pain and misery, as Chris was talking about. So if you're running a nonprofit in a Black community, you need to keep it moving. Use your education to educate your own people about how they have been oppressing us and depriving us of opportunity. Like I said, enough is enough with all of these systems and the harm that they're perpetuating against African Americans.
That's right. Ooh, Lord, I sure hope.
Could I ask something real quick on that?
Yeah, come on.
Tie it to the education context. I mean, all this stuff is interrelated, right? But when you were asking me the question about the book and the curriculum going into schools and school districts, right? So I've had a number of school districts right away on some, we love it, come on. You want to help us redesign our social studies program for middle school, for high school, English program for middle school, high school. And then I've had other districts like, nah, this is not what we're looking for. What's funny about that, and what's tied to what Kima was saying, is These are the same, again, colonial, I'm gonna keep using that, colonial educational systems. These are tools of our colonizer, tools of our oppressor, who are then saying, we're looking at your material, although you understand your culture, you are an expert when it comes to, they want to talk about hip hop pedagogy as an academic term. I'm an MC. I've toured domestically, I've toured internationally, I got albums, done all of that. So I understand the power of hip hop as an educational tool, but more importantly, as a revolutionary tool. And if you want, I haven't put any of my little resume stuff out there because I don't necessarily believe in that, but I have a master's in education. I have a clear credential in social studies. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you want to put value in those white institutions, I have a background there as well, but my community taught me how to work with my community, how to teach in my community. So I have all of that. I can put that on the table. These people saying, nah, this doesn't fit what we envision as culturally relevant. This doesn't fit what we envision as a pedagogical approach that is really going to be effective. And these are the same people that don't know how to teach our people in the first place. So then these people want to then again play gatekeeper as to why this program or this curriculum or these people who are vetted experts in our community on how to work with our community can't be in those spaces. That's why we can't be dependent on that apparatus. We have to do what we can independently, but then also figure out how we can use our leverage and strategically push those systems to do what they need to do, which is get out the way and allow us to come in as the experts and work with our young people. You know what I'm saying? And then we appropriate or expropriate those financial resources and bring them back into our community. So our people are being taken care of. We're able to provide more jobs for our folks and then bring that quality education to our young folks. But that's the cycle that it is when it comes to that curriculum conversation. They again want to play gatekeeper and say, nah, it doesn't fit our metric for what should be in front of our young people. And they don't understand us, don't understand our culture, don't know how to teach us. We know how to do it for ourselves. So now we have to be able to move in a different direction and bring that stuff to our community by any means necessary.
I think this point too, can I jump on it just for a second, Zakiya?
Yeah, one more.
This is why I think it's so important about contracts. Who gets in the schools and how they get into schools. Nekima and I have had problems with the school district in Minneapolis having virtualizing. They had software that teaches social studies that virtualizes the slave experience for kids. And the way that you win the game is you are a slave called Lucy. And the way that you win the game is by encountering white people and saying the right thing to them that helps you get through them, being docile.
It's still like that.
That is a curriculum in the district. And if you pay attention to who gets contracts and who doesn't, who gets the equity contracts and who doesn't, who gets the curriculum contracts, we've had more than one situation where we've had to fight to get racist curriculum out of the schools. And there were big money contracts, millions of dollars assigned to those racist curriculum. So when I hear Tyson talk, I'm thinking for local activists to be paying attention to how your district spends the money, how they make contracts, how they pass them, who gets them, make them show audits. We need numbers, we need receipts, we need to see what you've been doing and keep bearing them in requests for information because information is power. It is the one thing that will help us make these systems correct for us.
Absolutely.
No, that's excellent. And this next question is really piggybacking on a little bit of what you and Tyson just said, but this is a question from one of our audience members. I certainly hope they're still with us. It's pretty packed, so I want to try to maybe keep it to maybe 2 to 3 people to answer this one. But it says, why continue poor resources in an educational system that has failed Black people for generations? Woo. This assumes that even when they have adequate resources that our children will have access. What about opportunity hoarding in schools with adequate funding? That's y'all feel me? We got some audience members that's like they want some answers. So I see Tyson, you off mute. You coming in on that one.
I did, but you know what I'm saying. Well, all right. So this has been my approach, and I'm not saying my approach is the correct approach that we follow. I wrote Black Boy Poems. I created the Black Boy Poems curriculum, but I have a long-range vision. The long-range vision is we need to have our own independent educational institutions. But at this current moment in time, so today is June 10th, 2020, Do we have the ability to say, nah, we can't interact with these existing colonial educational structures where the majority of our students are at, and not try to find out how we can strategically get quality information and programming and curricula into those spaces and just be like, we're done with that? I mean, although we're in the COVID-19 moment where a lot of us have been pushed to do distance learning and try to figure out how we're going to provide education in a different way in our homes or in our communities, in many ways, we're still dependent on the institutions of our oppressor. And so in this current moment, I think it is strategically beneficial for us to come up with strategies for how we leverage and influence those systems to put quality resources and programs into spaces so our young people have access to it. But at the same time, we're building our own independent institutions that we control. And so we have some of those things with the independent homeschool networks and in independent schools. You know, I want to shout out where I'm at right now, a Black education network that's here in the Bay Area that's been doing this quality work for such a long time. But we don't, at this moment in time, we don't have those structures all the way in place to be able to say, take all of our students out of their schools and put them somewhere else. So we have to think about, and this is how I've been approaching it. We have to think about how we're going to use what's existing strategically and get that quality information in there, get those experts in there so our young people have access to it while we build up these independent things. And then eventually we'll be at that point where we can say, we don't need y'all no more. We have this built up everywhere that we're at, and our young people are going to get what they need from us, by us.
Can I
For us, by us. Yes, come on, Nekima. You know, I want Chris's view on it because that he on that wavelength too.
I just want to add something to what Tyson just said, though. The reality is that we are taught that we need these systems, but really they need us, right? As Chris had talked about earlier about our children being multi-million-dollar children, because so many people have jobs on the backs of our children and they are not effectively doing what they need to do. They're able to pay their mortgages, send their kids to college off the backs of our children who are being denied access to a high quality education and being taught that they are less than, that they are subpar, when we know that that is a completely false paradigm. So they need us more than we need them. But it's important for us to educate our community about that, because you know, we've had generations of indoctrination into white supremacy. And so many people in our community are just unaware of what's really going on and how these systems are impacting their children. And they also are not aware that they're not alone. You know, they think what's happening with their child is an isolated incident or just pertains to them. And they may not always know that this is systemic, it is systematic, it is brainwashing, it's all the things that we're talking about to keep us down in a society that we help to build. So we are going to have to do some more shifting and being more proactive within our community to make sure that we're educating people so that when those independent Black institutions, when those independent homeschooling networks are available, that people access them and they don't remain locked into a system that is underserving them.
That's absolutely right. And I would be remiss not to name, you know, the organization that I co-founded in Dayton, Ohio, Racial Justice Now, that my partner, my husband now works with in Leeds. And he, in collaboration with the Dignity in Schools campaign, created a culturally relevant curriculum toolkit. And it'll be placed in the comments, but that toolkit is something that, because Tyson, like he mentioned, you know, we're not able to just remove all of our kids from this colonial institution. So we have to create these interventions like the Black Boy poems and give these people tools to say, so they can't say, well, we don't know where the resources are. We haven't seen any resources, because that's one of the things that we've often heard of, especially in places in the Midwest, like Ohio. People will have amnesia, act like there's no toolkits or no resources for them to be able to access. And so we wanted to do that as an organization, understanding, right, that most of our children are still participating in the public school system, but at the same time, while we work towards that independent education system that Tyson brought up, we have to be creating and working with interventions in the meantime. Did anyone else have any thoughts on that question that you wanted to share really briefly? If not, I can go to the next question. We're going to take, I think, a couple of more questions. And also just want to encourage the folks who are still listening, please continue to post your questions in the comments. We will definitely work to get to all of them.
Zakiya, just super briefly,
Sure.
Stress pushing on the system side as well to do the work, right? I mean, we shouldn't have to be the ones really trying to sell and be there and knocking on the doors. Like, the system actually needs to do the work of identifying the Tysons of the world and bringing them in and asking them, what do they have? Like, there's work that has to happen on that side. And when I say the system, again, we're talking about schools, we're talking about districts, we're talking about states, and we're talking about philanthropy.
That's right. I appreciate that, Kedda, all of those intertwining systems. So I think we're going to try to take this question here. It says, what would it take to gain a critical mass in developing a plan undergirded by equity for all of the affinity groups in education? That's the question. What would it take to gain a critical mass? And that's honestly, I'll tell you really quickly, just as my quick response to that question, as a parent organizer who came to this work as an organizer organically, that's the question. I think we see moments where we have people who are willing to be engaged at the critical mass, but I think that, most of the times, particularly at the folks that I've organized, are people at the margins. And so if you have people who don't have their basic needs met, they ain't really thinking about the revolution, right? They're not thinking about, showing at the school board meetings and all this stuff that we, know that folks are expected to do to hold systems accountable, which is why I appreciate what Kedda is saying, that it's on the systems, right, and the institutions to be going out and looking for toolkits like the one that Racial Justice Now produced, to be looking for Tyson, to be looking for the Black Boy Bombs curriculum. Unfortunately, we have seen that has not been in their interest. So, what do you guys think that it would take to gain a critical mass of people to get all of this education for all the affinity groups, Native children, Asian children? We've seen ethnic studies out in Arizona and California. Where's the critical mass, y'all?
Well, I'll point out that I don't have a ton of hope or faith in the systems to identify the things for themselves, to self-correct or do the things that they're supposed to do. As a former school board member, I can tell you that I'm very cynical about the system's ability to do the right thing by our kids just on their own. I do believe in organizing. I believe in grassroots organizing. I believe that the only way you really get things done is by putting pressure on the people who supposedly represent you. I think in this case, it's been very hard because people have been trying to organize the revolution forever in education, to get many people to show up and kind of demand better. And it hasn't happened, but there's two things that I'll say about that. One, I'll say that we have a lot of Black and brown organizations that have budgets and staff and people and infrastructure. We're not broke as a people, right? We're not without any tools or weapons. If the UNCF and the Urban League and the NAACP, and I can keep going, Jack and Jill, and name a million other Black organizations that have budgets and people and money and fancy book learning and degrees and all kinds of good hotel conferences and everything else, if they were ever to have a common thought about what education should be for the Black child and the 8 million Black children in American public education, in American public schools, we might get somewhere, right? Because we're not broke. We got a lot of people in suits. We got a lot of people with Nordstrom cards. We got a lot of stuff going on in this world that if it were ever collective and brought together, we could really see something done for our kids. So that's one thing. The other thing is, for people who don't have the fancy suits and all that type of stuff, I can tell you this much. If every Black mother in the United States decided to keep their kids out of school until October 16th, every school year, the American public education system would change on a dime. So no, we can't get all of our kids out of these schools right away, but there's no place for them to go. There's always going to be settlers and explorers and pioneers. The settlers in the current system, the explorers who are searching for another one, the pioneers who are setting up the new place for us to live. There are always going to be those three groups of people. But for the settlers, it doesn't mean you have to settle for what they give you. keep your child out until October 16th and watch what happens.
See, I think jumping on that real quick, what Chris was saying, that could be one of the things that we contribute to as a body that's been brought together to participate in this panel. We have work to do. So we've discussed a lot, we've shared some resources, but if we're serious about how do we change this paradigm when it comes to education in our community, I think that's a great example. And so the resources that we do have access to. So if we're going to hold our young people out of school until a specific period of time, all right, so what are the support structures that we put in place? So there are, I mean, you already mentioned Baba Wakesa. We have Black Education Network, which has a whole bunch of resources for online homeschool educational activity. Black Boy Poems curriculum could be used for that. There's a lot of other things that we can point to where our young, our families, our community can have materials for elementary, middle school, high school. And so they're doing that until we get to, if we wanted to go to that October moment, or if we wanted to hold out beyond that and then test this out, what does it look like to show that we can be independent of their systems, of their structures? I think that's important. And so building that out so our community can see it and then be willing to take those steps to move in that direction. That's if that's something that we can contribute to, then it is our responsibility, it is our mandate to do that to the best of our ability. And I think we can. I think that's something that we can begin to offer up to our community as an alternative, because how can you be a free people if you were constantly dependent on the institutions of your oppressor? Can't be that. Right. And so let's build that, and then let's become that.
That's right. That's right. So this has been a very powerful and pleasurable experience for me to moderate and have all of you on as my guests and to share your expertise, your vision. Sounds like Tyson and Chris have given us our marching orders. I want to share with our audience and thank them for joining us, giving us all of your wonderful questions. I'm sure that the comments are great as well. But just thank you all for joining us. And I want to let you all know as well that this is not a one and done, right? This is going to be a series. Brightbeam is going to come together to host these virtual town halls, we hope on a monthly basis, where we are providing tools and strategies to get to that North Star that Chris and Tyson just so eloquently framed for the children at the margins in this country. It's been too long, and we think that it's up to us to begin to create alternatives to colonial education and to oppressive systems and structures in education. I want to allow you guys a few minutes, and please only take just maybe 1.5 minutes each, to just share some closing thoughts with our audience. Share some inspirational quote if you like, but just some closing thoughts with folks and how you want to leave people with this current discussion. And we'll start with Chris.
I wasn't ready for you to start with me, but this is what I'll say in closing. We are pushing for child justice in the cities. We think this is the moment to ask for it. Not to ask for it, but actually to demand it. We don't want a few programs. We don't want a few handouts, a few changes, a few tweaks to the existing system. We want leaders to be on the hot seat for a reset, for rethinking of how we have our leaders marshal all of their resources, pull together all of their people and all of their philanthropy, their unions, their nonprofits, to marshal that all on behalf of our children and make it so that we have just cities that are just for our children, and that they can grow and enjoy the prosperity of their cities because the police department is just, the school system is just, social services is just, the nonprofit sector is just. That's what we're fighting for. That's what we want to see. We need to demand it. And now is the moment to do it. Complete reset of justice in the cities. That's what we need.
Ashe, absolutely. Kedda.
So, Zakiya, this has been an amazing experience. Thank you so much for inviting me to the conversation. I just want to rein in the point that students and parents and families from the communities most impacted by the historic injustices in our system that we've all spent time identifying on this call, they are the ones who need to be engaged and centered as we work to develop solutions that will support the whole child and close the ever persistent achievement and opportunity gaps in our system. And I just really think that this is a moment to be imaginative and inventive so that we can design a system that is most responsive to our most vulnerable kids. And if we do that, I think everyone is going to win.
Absolutely. Rhonda?
You know, when we started planning this session together, we talked about reimagining.
Yes.
So now is not the time to just tamper at the margins of these systems that are jacking up our children.
Come on.
It's time to throw it all away and reimagine and build something brand new. And we cannot be afraid to disrupt. And now is the time to do that. And we have the will and the skill and the power in order to do it. And I'm here for it. Ashe.
Nekima.
Well, y'all already know I'm here for it.
Yes, we do.
Disruptors at every level, right? We cannot just be nice about this. I know some of y'all are so sweet and you're so kind, but there comes a point in time where you've had enough, at least I hope so, if you're in touch with your own humanity, where you use your power, you use your privilege, you use your position to stand up for our babies. They are the ones who suffer when we're silent. They're the ones when we have Black folks who are working in these systems who are complicit in what's happening. We're asking you to form your own underground railroad within these systems and start up for our children. Put some skin in the game for our babies. They deserve the best possible education. And it's up to us to make that happen at all levels. So don't be afraid. If you have to shut down a school board meeting, do what you got to do.
That's right.
You got to run for office. Do what you got to do and be willing to speak truth to power. Period.
Period. I love it. But that's a period with the T behind the D. Period. Come on, Tyson. Wrap us up.
That's all good. I love it. I'm over here so juiced off of what everybody has brought to this conversation. And what Chris was saying and the possibility that we have in front of us of truly trying to shape an agenda in our community of becoming independent of these systems. We can do that, y'all. We can do that. And I really don't like saying like my stuff, my name and the I stuff, because this is a community.
No, but we need it. Come on, it's okay.
I get you. But you know, there's a quote attributed to Malcolm, and Malcolm said, when I is replaced with we, even illness becomes wellness. You know what I'm saying? It's a powerful statement. So I don't like the I's, but we all have a role to play. And so with the Black Boy Poems curriculum, not a commercial thing, but if y'all are interested, we're making the Black Boy Poems curriculum online available to anybody watching. All you got to do, you can go to the Citizen Ed page. There's a link at the very bottom of the page. Or if you just wanted to contact me directly, it's very easy to do that. You can just email blackboypoems@gmail.com. Let me know you want access to that. I'll give you access to that, because we have to see we have resources within our grasp right now that we can use to provide quality revolutionary education in our community and help us start developing those independent institutions or support existing independent institutions so our young people can get what they need. That's what this is about. We're here for our young people. We got to support them as much as we can. And we all have a role to play in creating this revolutionary change for our community. So let's do what we can and let's bring this change, power to the people by any means necessary. Let's be about it, y'all.
All of that. And really quickly before we wrap up, thank you so much to all of my guests. I want to do a quick infomercial. I have no problem doing this commercial really quickly. Next Wednesday, I will be launching my own Facebook show here on the Citizen Ed platform, and join me for the first guest. Runner in the fight for education and racial justice in the Delta of Mississippi. I am using my platform to uplift the voice of elders, to uplift the voice of grassroots folks across this country who are doing real work in our communities. And so we're going to hear from an OG next week about her work in the Mississippi Delta. We got to think about our folks everywhere. Mississippi has the highest population per capita of Black people in this country, and I'm excited that she's my first guest. Thank you all so much for joining us. Until then, see y'all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a wrap.